Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Meaning was not invented, but was given, was not constructed, but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection, but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there, and the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option. And without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different. And what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values. And so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen. And choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable. is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself, rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity, the flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction. And conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story. And what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance. And the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning. And the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not. Many cannot. Many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not. And the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, there is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence, and the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Belief does not wait for evidence, does not require justification, does not emerge from careful reasoning, but appears fully formed, arrives with conviction intact, and only afterward does the mind scramble to find reasons, to construct arguments, to build the scaffolding of rationality around a conclusion that was never reached through rationality in the first place. And this sequence is backward from what is taught, from what people believe about their own thinking, from the narrative that says humans are rational creatures who form beliefs by weighing evidence and following logic to wherever it leads. But the narrative is false, is a story the conscious mind tells about processes. It does not control and barely witnesses, because the formation of belief happens beneath awareness, happens in systems that operate according to principles that have nothing to do with truth and everything to do with survival, with coalition, with identity, with the deep need to belong to a group and signal loyalty to that group through the adoption of its beliefs. And the adoption is not chosen, is not deliberate, is automatic, is the result of exposure and repetition and emotional resonance. And once a belief is formed, it becomes self-protecting, becomes resistant to challenge, becomes the lens through which all subsequent information is filtered. And the filter is not neutral, does not simply organize data, but actively distorts it, amplifies what confirms, and minimizes what contradicts. And this distortion is not dishonesty, but cognition, is the normal operation of a mind that is not designed to find truth, but to maintain coherence, to protect existing beliefs from disintegration, to avoid the cognitive and social costs of changing one's mind. And the costs are high, are often higher than the costs of being wrong, because being wrong in private is invisible, but changing one's mind in public is betrayal, is defection, is the signal that one is unreliable, is not committed, is willing to abandon the group. And groups punish this, punish uncertainty, punish the appearance of wavering, reward certainty even when the certainty is unjustified, especially when it is unjustified, Because justified certainty requires evidence, and evidence is ambiguous, and ambiguity is threatening to group cohesion, but unjustified certainty, certainty that comes from faith, from commitment, from identity, is the strongest signal of loyalty, is the proof that one believes not because the evidence compels, but because the group demands, and this demand is the engine of belief, is what makes convictions stick, what makes them resistant to argument, what makes smart people believe wrong things, not despite their intelligence, but because of it. Because intelligence is a tool, and tools can be used for any purpose, including the purpose of defending beliefs that were never formed through intelligence in the first place. And the defense is sophisticated, is elaborate, is often more complex than the defenses offered by less intelligent believers, because the intelligent mind has more resources, more information, more ability to construct rationalizations that sound convincing, that appear logical, that give the impression of having been arrived at through careful thought when really they are working backward from a conclusion that was never in question. And the conclusion was never in question because it was not a conclusion but a premise, was not the end of reasoning but the beginning, was the starting point that determined which evidence would be noticed, which arguments would be persuasive, which authorities would be trusted. And trust is not distributed evenly across all sources, but is allocated according to alignment, according to whether the source supports the belief or challenges it. And sources that support are credible, are reliable, are worth listening to, while sources that challenge are biased, are corrupt, are motivated by hidden agendas. And this asymmetry is not recognized by the believer, is not seen as bias but as discernment, as the ability to distinguish good information from bad. And the distinguishing is easy because good information is information that confirms, and bad information is information that contradicts. And this is motivated reasoning, is the process by which the mind arrives at the conclusions it wants to arrive at while maintaining the illusion of objectivity, the sense that the conclusion was forced by evidence rather than selected in advance, and the illusion is convincing, is believed by the person doing the reasoning, is not cynical manipulation, but sincere self-deception, is the mind fooling itself, because being fooled is useful, is adaptive, is what allows people to hold beliefs with confidence, even when the beliefs are unsupported, and confidence is what matters socially, is what others respond to, is what makes a belief persuasive, not because it's true but because it's held strongly, and strength of conviction is mistaken for strength of evidence, is treated as signal that the believer knows something, has access to information, has done the thinking, when really the strength comes from identity, from the fact that the belief is tied to who the person is, to what group they belong to what side they are on. And sides are not chosen through reasoning, are chosen through affiliation, through accidents of birth and circumstance, through exposure to certain narratives at formative moments. And once the side is chosen, the beliefs come with it, come as package, come as the price of membership. And the price is paid gladly, because membership is worth more than truth, is worth more than accuracy, is the thing that makes life meaningful, that provides identity, that offers protection. And protection requires conformity, requires that everyone in the group believes the same things, or at least claims to believe them, and the claiming becomes believing through repetition, through public commitment, through the performance of belief that eventually converts into genuine conviction. And the conversion happens without awareness, happens gradually, happens through the mechanism that psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction, where the mind alters beliefs to match behavior because behavior is harder to change, is more visible, is more socially consequential, and so the internal adjusts to match the external, and what was performed becomes believed, and what was believed becomes identity. And identity is the deepest level, is the level at which challenge feels like attack, like assault on the self, and the self defends, mobilizes resources, recruits intelligence in service of protection, and intelligence is effective, is dangerous in this role because it can construct arguments that are superficially compelling, that exploit real ambiguities in evidence, that find the weak points in opposing positions. And these arguments are not offered in search of truth, but in defense of identity. Are weapons, not tools, are designed to win, not to discover, and winning means making the other side look wrong, look foolish, look motivated by bias. And the accusation of bias is always available, is always applicable, because everyone is biased, everyone is motivated, everyone is reasoning from premises they did not choose and cannot justify except by appeal to other premises they also did not choose. And so the accusations are symmetrical, are hurled back and forth without resolution, without movement, without any possibility of convergence, because convergence would require both sides to treat truth as the goal, to be willing to change their minds if evidence demanded it. But evidence never demands anything. Evidence is passive, is interpreted, is filtered through the beliefs that are already in place. And the beliefs that are already in place are determined by identity, by group membership, by tribal affiliation, and tribes do not care about truth except insofar as truth claims serve tribal interests, serve to distinguish us from them, serve to mark boundaries, to maintain cohesion, to provide narratives that explain why we are good and they are bad, why our beliefs are justified and theirs are delusions. And the asymmetry is total, is never recognized as asymmetry, but always experienced as accurate perception, as seeing clearly while others are blind, and the blindness is attributed to stupidity or dishonesty or indoctrination, never to the same mechanisms that are operating in oneself, because one's own beliefs are transparent, are not seen as beliefs but as obvious facts, as the way things are, and the way things are is not up for debate, is not subject to revision, is the foundation on which everything else is built, and challenging the foundation threatens the structure, threatens everything. And so the challenge is rejected, is deflected, is met with hostility or mockery, or the dismissal that treats the challenger as not worth engaging, as beneath consideration, as so obviously wrong that responding would be a waste of time. And the waste is avoided, the belief is preserved, the identity is protected, and life continues with certainty intact, with the conviction that one is right, has always been right, will always be right, because being right is not a state that can be verified, but is a state that is claimed, is performed, is the stance that the group requires and the individual provides. And the providing is not sacrifice, but fulfillment, is not loss but gain, is the way that belonging is achieved, is the way that meaning is found, is the way that the chaos of existence is organized into a coherent narrative where the self is on the right side, is part of the good, is aligned with truth, even if truth is never actually encountered, never actually sought, never actually valued except as a rhetorical weapon to use against opponents. And opponents are necessary, are required by the logic of tribal epistemology, are the ones whose wrongness confirms our rightness, whose existence justifies our beliefs, whose errors prove our accuracy, and the errors are easy to find, because looking for errors is what confirmation bias does, is the selective attention that notices everything that supports the belief and overlooks everything that contradicts it. And the overlooking is not deliberate, is not conscious suppression, but automatic filtering, is the mind attending to what it expects, what it is primed to see. And the priming comes from belief, comes from the framework that determines what is salient, what is relevant, what is worth noticing, and what is worth noticing is always what confirms, is always what can be incorporated into the narrative, and the narrative is not discovered but constructed, is built from selected pieces of evidence that are arranged to tell a story, and the story is always the same story, is always the one where we are right and they are wrong, where our beliefs are based on evidence and theirs are based on bias, where we are rational and they are emotional, where we are honest seekers of truth and they are motivated by power or fear, or some other corrupt motive, and the motives that are attributed to others are never attributed to the self, are never seen as operating in one's own reasoning, because one's own reasoning is transparent, is experienced as simply responding to facts, as following evidence, as arriving at conclusions that are forced rather than chosen, and the forcing as illusion is the feeling that arises when motivated reasoning is operating smoothly, when the mind has successfully convinced itself that the conclusion it wanted to reach is the conclusion that evidence demands, and the demand is retroactive, is constructed after the fact, is the rationalization that makes the belief feel justified, that allows it to be held with confidence, that enables the believer to defend it against challenge and feel virtuous in the defending. And virtue is the reward, is what makes belief feel good, feel right, feel like something more than preference. And the more than preference is what gives belief its power, its capacity to motivate action, to organize communities, to inspire sacrifice, because preference can be changed, can be updated, can be revealed as merely subjective. But belief that is felt as knowledge, as truth, as correspondence to reality, is not subject to change, is not vulnerable to challenge, is the rock on which identity is built. And the rock is not geology but psychology, is not objective but constructed, is not discovered in the world but imposed on the world. And the imposition is what makes the world intelligible, what makes experience coherent, what prevents the vertigo of radical uncertainty. And uncertainty is intolerable, is the state that humans will do almost anything to avoid, will believe almost anything to escape. And the escape is into certainty, into conviction, into the feeling of knowing. And the feeling is what matters, is what provides comfort, is what makes belief functional regardless of whether it is true. And truth is a secondary concern, is something that is appealed to but not pursued, is a value that is claimed but not practiced, because practicing it would require epistemic humility, would require admitting that one could be wrong, that one's beliefs could be mistaken, that the group could be misguided. And these admissions are costly, are signals of weakness, are invitations for opponents to attack. An attack is what happens when certainty is dropped, when doubt is expressed, when the fortress of belief shows cracks and the cracks are not tolerated, are repaired immediately, are filled with rationalizations and justifications, and appeals to authority. And authority is not expertise but alignment, is not knowledge but membership, is the voice of the group speaking through individuals who have internalized its beliefs so thoroughly that they cannot distinguish their own thoughts from the thoughts they were given. And the giving is not noticed, is not experienced as indoctrination, but as education, as the transmission of knowledge, as the inheritance of wisdom. And wisdom is what every group claims to possess, is the special access to truth that justifies its existence, that explains why belonging matters, why loyalty is required, why defection is unforgivable. And the unforgivable is treated with expulsion, with shunning, with the withdrawal of recognition that makes social existence possible. And the possibility of this withdrawal is what keeps believers in line, keeps them performing the beliefs, even when doubt arises, even when evidence contradicts, even when the rational part of the mind recognizes that the belief is unsupported, because the rational part is weak, is outvoted by the social part, by the emotional part, by the parts that understand that survival depends on belonging, and belonging depends on belief. And so belief is maintained, is performed, is protected against challenge, not because it is true, but because it's necessary, is the price of membership, is the cost of identity, and the cost is paid continuously, is paid in the suppression of doubt, in the dismissal of contrary evidence, in the construction of elaborate rationalizations that allow the belief to persist despite its failures, despite its contradictions, despite the mounting evidence that it is wrong, and wrong is what every belief eventually becomes, is the fate of all convictions that are held rigidly, that refuse to update, that treat themselves as final, as complete, as not subject to revision, because the world changes, because evidence accumulates, because what was plausible becomes implausible, and the implausible becomes undeniable, and the undeniable is denied anyway, is rejected through the mechanisms of motivated reasoning that are so powerful, so sophisticated, so effective at maintaining belief in the face of counter-evidence that they can preserve convictions long after those convictions have ceased to correspond to anything in reality. And the lack of correspondence does not matter, does not affect the strength of belief, does not reduce confidence, because belief is not about correspondence, is not about mapping the world accurately, is about maintaining identity, maintaining belonging, maintaining the narratives that make the group cohere. And coherence is more important than accuracy, is more valuable than truth, is what holds communities together, what makes collective action possible, what allows humans to coordinate at scale. And scale requires shared belief, requires that everyone is operating from the same assumptions, the same frameworks, the same narratives, and the sharing is not achieved through evidence, but through repetition, through ritual, through the constant reinforcement of the beliefs that define the group. And the reinforcement is everywhere, is in the stories that are told, the heroes that are celebrated, the enemies that are vilified, the history that is remembered and the history that is forgotten, and the remembering and forgetting are selective, are curated to support the narrative, to make the group look good, to make its beliefs seem justified, seem necessary, seem like the only reasonable position. And reasonableness is performance, is the appearance of having arrived at belief through rational process, when really the process is post hoc, is the construction of justification for conclusions that were reached through identity, through emotion, through the non-rational processes that govern most of human belief. And the most is almost all, is the vast majority of what people believe, is believed not because evidence compels, but because believing is required, is expected, is the condition of membership in the groups that provide meaning and purpose and protection. And without these groups, the individual is lost, is isolated, is without framework, without narrative, without the stories that make sense of suffering, that explain why things happen, that provide hope that the future will be better, or at least that the struggle is meaningful. And meaning is what belief provides, is the primary function, is more important than accuracy, more valuable than truth. Because humans can tolerate being wrong, but cannot tolerate meaninglessness, cannot survive without the sense that life is going somewhere, that actions matter, that the side they are on is the right side, and the right side is always the side they are on, is always the group they belong to, is determined by belonging rather than determining it. And this circularity is invisible, is not recognized as circularity, but experienced as logical necessity, as the way things obviously are. And the obvious is what is most suspect, is what most needs examination, is where belief is most rigid, most defended, most immune to challenge, because the obvious is the foundation, is the premise that cannot be questioned without everything else collapsing, and collapse is unacceptable, is the threat that keeps belief in place, that makes certainty feel like safety and doubt feel like danger. And so certainty wins, always. Wins not because it is right, but because it is functional, is what the mind needs to operate, to make decisions, to navigate the world. And navigation does not require truth, only requires consistency, requires beliefs that are stable enough to be acted upon. And stability is what identity provides, is what tribal epistemology achieves, is the freezing of belief into doctrine, into dogma, into the unquestionable truths that define the group and exclude the other. And exclusion is the point, is the function, is what makes identity possible. Because identity is not what you are, but what you're not, is defined by boundaries, by the line that separates us from them, believers from heretics, the enlightened from the deluded. And the delusion is always on the other side, is always what they suffer from, never what afflicts us, because we see clearly, we have truth, we are right, and the rightness is not a conclusion but a premise, is not the end of inquiry, but the foreclosing of inquiry, is the state that belief aims for and maintained through every mechanism available, through confirmation bias, through motivated reasoning, through tribal epistemology, through the subordination of truth to identity. And the subordination is complete, is total, is the condition of believing anything at all. Because belief without evidence is not the exception, but the rule is not a failure of reasoning, but the normal operation of minds that are not designed for truth, but for survival, for belonging, for the construction of narratives that make life bearable. And bearable is all that is required, is all that can be expected, is the standard that belief meets regardless of whether it meets any other standard, and other standards are luxuries, are the concerns of those who have the security to question, to doubt, to examine their beliefs, without fearing the social consequences. But most do not have this security. Most cannot afford doubt, cannot risk uncertainty, cannot survive without the conviction that they are right, that their beliefs are justified, that the group they belong to has access to truth, and the access is never demonstrated, never verified, never subjected to test, is only asserted, only performed, only maintained through the constant repetition of the beliefs that constitute the group. And the constitution is circular, is self-referential, is the tautology that defines all tribal epistemology. That we are right because we believe what we believe, and we believe what we believe because we are right. And the circle is unbreakable from within, can only be seen from outside. From the perspective of someone who does not share the belief, who has not internalized the identity, who can see the mechanisms operating, and the seeing changes. Nothing convinces no one, because the believer is not operating from evidence and cannot be swayed by evidence, is operating from identity and can only be swayed by changes in identity, by shifts in belonging, by the rare and difficult transformation that allows a person to leave one group and join another, to abandon one set of beliefs and adopt another. And the adoption is not reasoned, but is the same non-rational process operating in a different direction, is the formation of new convictions without evidence, is the replacement of one certainty with another certainty. And the certainty is what matters, is what the mind needs, is what belief provides, regardless of content, regardless of truth, regardless of anything except the function of making the world intelligible, making the self coherent, making belonging possible. And possibility is all that belief promises, is all that it delivers, is the opening of a space where life can be lived with conviction, with purpose, with the sense that one knows what is true and what is false, what is good and what is evil, what side to be on and what side to oppose, and the opposition is necessary, is required by the structure of belief, is what makes belief matter, what gives it weight, what makes it worth defending, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when every rational consideration suggests it should be abandoned, because abandoning belief is abandoning identity, is abandoning belonging, is abandoning meaning, and meaning is what makes existence tolerable, is what makes life worth living. And this worth is not measured in truth, but in function, not in correspondence, but in coherence, not in accuracy, but in the capacity to organize experience into narratives that can be shared, that can be believed, that can be held, with the conviction that comes not from evidence but from faith. And faith is not the opposite of reason, but its foundation is the ground on which all reasoning occurs, is the set of premises that cannot themselves be justified but must be assumed, must be taken on faith, must be believed without evidence, because evidence requires premises, and premises require faith, and the faith is inescapable, is built into the structure of belief, is what makes belief possible, is what makes the mechanics of belief mechanical, automatic, operating below awareness, producing convictions that arrive fully formed and are only later dressed in the clothing of reason, given the appearance of having been derived from evidence when really they were derived from identity, from belonging, from the deep and desperate human need to be part of something larger, to believe something strongly, to know with certainty, even if the knowing is illusion, and the certainty is performance, and the belief is wrong. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organization of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, the organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness that shortens life. And the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present, in the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete, because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns, when the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness, where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission, and the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages, and the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into, and the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples, and the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation. And the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honours the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve. And achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. Power does not distribute evenly, does not spread across populations in equal measure, does not settle into equilibrium where everyone has the same, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms gradients that are steep, that create hierarchies that are natural, not in the sense of being just, but in the sense of being inevitable, being the default pattern that emerges whenever humans organize, whenever groups form, whenever coordination is needed. And the need for coordination is constant, is the condition of social existence, and coordination requires decision-making, requires that someone decides when decisions cannot be made collectively, when consensus is impossible, when speed is necessary, and the necessity creates the opening for power, creates the opportunity for some to decide for others, and the deciding is power, is the core of it, is the ability to shape outcomes, to determine directions, to control resources, and once this ability concentrates, once some have it more than others, the concentration tends to increase, tends to amplify, tends to create the hierarchies that are visible in every society, every organization, every group that persists over time because power reproduces power, is self-reinforcing, is creating the conditions that allow more power to accumulate, and the accumulation is not accidental, is not the result of conspiracy, is the natural geometry of social organization, is the shape that power takes when humans interact over time, and the shape is pyramidal, is hierarchical, is arranging people into levels, into ranks, into positions that vary in their access to resources, to decision-making, to influence, and the variation is not small, is not modest, is extreme, is exponential, is creating gaps between levels that are wider than the gaps within levels. And the widest gap is at the top, is between those who have power and those who do not. And those who have power are few, are the minority, are the elite who sit at the apex of the hierarchy. And the apex is narrow, is limited, is only accommodating a small number, because power shared is power diluted, is power threatened, is power that might be challenged, and so those at the top work to maintain their position, work to prevent others from ascending, work to ensure that the hierarchy remains steep, remains stable, remains resistant to change. And the resistance is not passive, is active, is the exercise of power to preserve power, is the use of resources to maintain access to resources, is the employment of influence to prevent the emergence of rival influences. And the employment is continuous, is strategic, is operating at multiple levels, through multiple mechanisms, through the formal and the informal, through the visible and the invisible, through the structures that are explicit and the processes that are hidden. And the hidden is where power is most effective, is where it operates without being seen, without being named, without being recognized as power. Because power that is visible is power that can be challenged, that can be resisted, that can be opposed, but power that is invisible, that operates through assumptions, through norms, through the structures that are taken for granted, is power that is unassailable, is power that reproduces itself without anyone noticing, without anyone objecting, without anyone having the language to describe what is happening. And what is happening is the maintenance of hierarchy through the thousand small mechanisms that ensure power stays where it is, that prevent redistribution, that make equality impossible, not just difficult, but structurally impossible, because the system is designed to concentrate power, is organized to funnel resources upward, is arranged to ensure that those at the top remain at the top. And the remaining is not guaranteed by force alone, is not maintained through violence alone, though violence is always available, is always in the background, is the ultimate guarantee of hierarchy. But most of the time force is not needed, is not employed because power has more subtle tools, has mechanisms that operate through consent, through the willing participation of those who are dominated. And the willing is not coerced in the obvious sense, is not forced at gunpoint, is produced through ideology, through the stories that are told about why hierarchy is natural, is necessary, is beneficial. And the beneficial is what those at the top claim, is what they teach, is what they convince others to believe, that hierarchy serves everyone, that power at the top creates order that protects those below, that inequality is the price of stability, of prosperity, of progress, and progress is the mythology that justifies hierarchy, that makes inequality seem temporary, that makes power seem earned, that makes the concentration seem like the result of merit rather than of position. And position is what matters, is what determines outcomes, is what makes some people powerful and others powerless. But the position is inherited, is transmitted, is maintained across generations through the mechanisms that convert power into wealth and wealth into power. And the conversion is seamless, is automatic, is the way that hierarchy perpetuates itself, that ensures that the children of the powerful are powerful, that the descendants of the elite remain elite, that the system reproduces itself. And the reproduction is not perfect, is not total. There is some mobility, some movement between levels, some stories of ascent that serve to legitimate the system, that create the illusion of meritocracy, that make it seem as though anyone can rise, but the rising is rare, is exceptional, is the exception that proves the rule. And the rule is that power stays where it is, that hierarchy is stable, that the geometry is fixed, and the fixing is not natural in the sense of being inevitable by physics, but is natural in the sense of emerging from the logic of organization, from the mathematics of networks, from the dynamics of accumulation, because power is not zero-sum in the short term, can grow, can expand, can create more power, but in the long term, in the context of limited resources, of finite opportunities, of scarce positions, power is rivalrous, is competed for, is gained by some at the expense of others. And the gaining is easier for those who already have power, is easier from positions of advantage, is following the principle that Matthew identified, that to those who have more will be given, And from those who have little, even what they have will be taken, and the taking is not theft, is not crime, is the normal operation of systems that concentrate power, that funnel resources upward, that ensure that advantage compounds, that success breeds success, that power accumulates and the accumulation is exponential, is accelerating, is creating gaps that widen over time, that make the top more distant from the bottom, that make mobility less possible, that make hierarchy more rigid, more entrenched, more resistant to change. And the resistance is structural, is built into the geometry, is not requiring conspiracy, not requiring explicit coordination, is just the natural result of power protecting itself, of those at the top using their position to maintain their position. And the maintenance is not cynical, is not experienced as exploitation, is justified through ideologies that explain why hierarchy is good, why power deserves to be concentrated, why inequality is natural. And natural is the word that does the work, is the justification, is the claim that hierarchy is not created by humans, but is discovered in nature, is visible in animals, in the dominance hierarchies that primates form, that wolves form, that even chickens form, and the forming is instinctive, is biological, is the way that evolution has shaped social species. And if it is natural, then it is not unjust, is not wrong, is simply the way things are, and the way things are is the most powerful justification, is the argument that requires no argument, is the appeal to inevitability, to necessity, to the claim that hierarchy cannot be otherwise. And the cannot is false, is ideological, is the masking of choice as fate, is the presentation of arrangement as nature. Because hierarchies are arrangements, are geometries that are created, that are maintained, that are enforced, and the enforcement is continuous, is requiring effort, is revealing that the naturalness is myth, is story, is the cover for power, for the exercise of domination, for the structuring of society in ways that benefit the top at the expense of the bottom. And the bottom is where most people are, is the base of the pyramid, is the many who support the few, who generate the resources that are concentrated at the apex, who do the work that creates the wealth that flows upward. And the flowing is not natural, but is designed, is structured through laws, through institutions, through the mechanisms that extract value from the many and deliver it to the few. And the delivery is called profit, is called return, is called the reward for capital, for ownership, for the position of controlling resources. And control is power, is the core of it, is the ability to decide how resources are used, who benefits, who is excluded, and the exclusion is the mechanism, is how hierarchy maintains itself, is how power reproduces power, because access is limited, is restricted, is controlled by those who already have access. And access to what? To opportunities, to resources, to the positions that confer power. And the conferring is not automatic, is not open, is requiring credentials, requiring connections, requiring the social capital that comes from position. And position is inherited, is transmitted, is the thing that makes hierarchy stable, that prevents mobility, that ensures that the geometry remains fixed. And the fixed is what those at the top want, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend through the mechanisms that are both overt and covert, that operate through law and through culture, through institutions and through norms, through the structures that are formal and the processes that are informal. And the informal is where much of the work happens, is where power operates most effectively, through networks, through relationships, through the soft power that is harder to see, harder to challenge, harder to dismantle than the hard power of force, of law, of explicit command, because soft power operates through influence, through persuasion, through the shaping of desires and beliefs, through the creation of consent. And consent is what makes hierarchy stable, is what allows domination without constant coercion, is what Gramsci called hegemony, is the condition where the dominated accept their domination, where the powerless believe in the legitimacy of power, where the hierarchy seems natural, seems right, seems like the way things should be, and the should is the achievement, is the conversion of power into authority, of domination into legitimacy, of hierarchy into order. And order is what power promises, is what it delivers, is the stability that comes from everyone knowing their place, accepting their rank, performing their role, and the performing is not resisted because resistance seems pointless, seems impossible, seems like challenging nature itself, and nature is the mask, is the story, is the ideology that makes power invisible, that makes hierarchy seem inevitable, that makes inequality seem like the necessary cost of civilization. And civilization is the achievement of hierarchy, is the organization of humans into structures that are complex, that are specialized, that are requiring coordination. And coordination is impossible without power, without hierarchy, without someone deciding, someone directing, someone controlling. And the controlling is concentrated, is centralized, is accumulating at the top. And the top is where decisions are made, where resources are allocated, where the direction is set. And the setting is not democratic, is not collective, is not reflecting the will of the many, but is reflecting the interests of the few, of those who have power, of those who sit at the apex. And the apex is maintained through the geometry, through the structure that ensures power flows upward, that resources concentrate, that advantage compounds. And the compounding is what makes hierarchy self-perpetuating, is what makes power stable, is what prevents the redistribution that would create equality. And equality is unstable, is impossible to maintain, is the condition that immediately begins to dissolve once it is achieved. Because humans are not equal in ability, in effort, in ambition. And these differences, even small differences, compound over time, create advantages, create positions, create the beginnings of hierarchy. And once hierarchy begins, it accelerates, it amplifies, it creates the geometry that is inevitable. That is natural, not because it is good, but because it is the pattern that emerges from the mathematics of accumulation, from the logic of networks, from the dynamics of power, and power, seeks to grow, seeks to concentrate, and the concentration is resisted, is challenged, is fought against by those who are excluded, by those who are dominated, by those who suffer under hierarchy. But the resistance is difficult, is requiring coordination, is requiring resources, is requiring power. And power is what the powerless lack, is what they're excluded from, is what makes resistance so difficult, so costly, so often unsuccessful. And the unsuccessful is what history shows, is what the record demonstrates, is the pattern of hierarchies rising and falling, but never disappearing, never being replaced by equality, only being replaced by new hierarchies, by new elites, by new concentrations of power that reproduce the geometry, that maintain the structure, that ensure that power remains concentrated, that hierarchy remains the default, remains the pattern, remains the inevitable outcome of human organization. And the organization is what creates power, is what makes hierarchy necessary, or seems to make it necessary. Because organization requires coordination, and coordination requires decision-making, and decision-making requires power. And power is what some have and others do not. And those who have it work to keep it, work to grow it, work to pass it on. And the passing on is inheritance, is the mechanism of reproduction, is what makes hierarchy stable across time. And the stability is what those at the top value, is what they work to maintain, is what they defend against challenges, against redistribution, against the equality that would threaten their position. And the position is everything, is what determines outcomes, is what makes life easy or hard, is what provides access or denies it, is what confers power or withholds it. And the withholding is structural, is built into the geometry, is the way that hierarchy maintains itself, is the iron law that Michael's identified, is the principle that all organizations, even those founded on egalitarian principles, eventually develop hierarchies, eventually concentrate power, eventually create oligarchies, because organization requires leadership, and leadership becomes power, and power becomes self-perpetuating, becomes the thing that shapes the organization to serve the leaders rather than the members. And the members are the many, are the base, are those who do the work but do not make the decisions, do not control the resources, do not have the power, and the power is what accumulates at the top, is what defines the apex, is what makes hierarchy hierarchical, and the hierarchical is the geometry, is the structure, is the arrangement that is not accidental, is not temporary, is not the result of bad actors or flawed systems, but is the natural pattern, the inevitable outcome, the shape that power takes when humans organize, when groups form, when societies persist, and the persistence is what makes hierarchy visible, is what reveals the geometry, is what shows that power does not distribute evenly, does not create equality, does not settle into balance, but instead concentrates, accumulates, forms the pyramids that are visible everywhere, in every society, in every organization, in every context where humans coordinate, and the coordination requires hierarchy, or seems to require it, and the seeming is enough, is what makes it real, is what makes the geometry inevitable, is what ensures that power will concentrate, that inequality will persist, that hierarchy will remain the default pattern, the natural arrangement, the geometry of power that shapes human life, that determines outcomes, that creates the world where some have much and most have little, where some decide and most obey, where some rule and most are ruled, and the ruling is not eternal, is not permanent. Hierarchies fall, are replaced, are overturned, but they are not eliminated, are not abolished, are not transcended, because the geometry remains, the pattern persists, the structure reasserts itself, and new hierarchies form, new elites emerge, new concentrations of power accumulate at new apexes, and the cycle continues. The pattern repeats, the geometry remains. Because power concentrates, because hierarchy is natural, because equality is unstable, because the geometry of power is not optional, is not chosen, is not the result of conspiracy or design, but is the inevitable outcome, the natural pattern, the way that power arranges itself when humans organize, and the organizing never stops, and the hierarchy never ends, and the geometry persists, always, inevitably, naturally, as the shape of power, as the structure of domination, as the pattern that defines human society, that creates inequality, that maintains hierarchy, that ensures that power remains concentrated, that the few rule the many, that the apex dominates the base, that the geometry of power remains fixed, remains stable, remains the eternal pattern, the natural arrangement, the inevitable structure that is hierarchy, that is power. That is the way things are and have always been and will always be, as long as humans organize, as long as groups form, as long as power exists, and power always exists, always concentrates, always creates the geometry that is hierarchy, that is domination, that is the natural, inevitable, inescapable pattern of human organization, and the organization is power, and power is hierarchy, and hierarchy is geometry, and the geometry is eternal. Language shapes thought, shapes what can be conceived, what can be expressed, what can be hidden, and most languages allow hiding, allow the gap between what is thought and what is said, allow the performance of statements that do not correspond to internal states, that present as true what is known to be false, that create the possibility of deception, of lying, of the mismatch between inner and outer that is fundamental to social existence as it is currently lived. But what if language did not allow this mismatch? What if the grammar itself prevented the expression of anything except what is actually believed, what is actually experienced, what is actually the case from the speaker's perspective. Not objective truth, which is unknowable, but subjective honesty, which is the correspondence between what is felt and what is said. And the correspondence would be mandatory, would be built into the structure of the language, into the syntax that determines what can be grammatically formed, what sentences are possible, and the possible would exclude any statement that the speaker does not believe, that does not match the speaker's internal state, that constitutes a lie. And lying would not be immoral in such a language, but would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be like trying to form a sentence that violates the rules of syntax, that cannot be uttered, not because it's forbidden, but because it's not a sentence in the language, is not something that the grammar allows, and the allowing is what determines what can be thought, what can be expressed, what can be communicated. And if the grammar does not allow lying, then lying becomes not just difficult, but inconceivable, becomes not something that is avoided through moral effort, but something that is impossible through structural constraint. And the constraint is liberating in one sense and terrifying in another, is eliminating the burden of deciding whether to lie, of managing impressions, of performing honesty while concealing dishonesty, but is also eliminating privacy, is making internal states visible, is forcing expression of thoughts and feelings that in normal languages can be hidden, can be kept private, can be protected from others, through the simple expedient of not saying them or saying something else instead. And the instead is what becomes impossible, is what the grammar prevents, is what makes this language unlike any language that currently exists. Though hints of it appear in languages that have complex evidential systems, that require speakers to mark how they know what they're claiming, whether through direct perception, through inference, through hearsay, and the hearsay is marked differently than the directly witnessed, is grammatically distinguished, is making it impossible to claim direct knowledge of something that was only heard about. And the hearing about is different from the seeing, is marked as different, is forcing honesty about the source of information, about the reliability of knowledge, about the basis for claims. And the basis must be indicated, must be grammatically encoded, must be part of every statement. And this encoding is a constraint on lying, is making certain kinds of deception difficult, is revealing the grounds of knowledge, but is not eliminating lying entirely, is not preventing the claim that something was directly witnessed when it was not, is allowing the lie about the source, even if the source must be stated, but the language that makes lying impossible would go further, would not just require marking of evidentiality, but would make the marking automatic, would make it impossible to state anything that is not believed, that is not supported by the evidence that the speaker has, that does not correspond to the speaker's actual internal state. And the internal state would be expressed, would be forced into expression, would become public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become confession, would become revelation, would become the exposure of thoughts and feelings that are usually hidden, that are usually managed, that are usually performed rather than expressed. And the expression would be mandatory, would be built into the grammar, would make every utterance honest not through virtue, but through structure, not through choice, but through constraint. And the constraint is what makes lying impossible, is what eliminates deception, is what creates a form of communication that is radically different from what humans are accustomed to. And the accustomed is lying, is deception, is the constant management of what is said, what is revealed, what is hidden. And the hidden is vast, is most of what is thought, is most of what is felt, is kept private through the simple mechanism of not speaking it. And the not speaking is what the language prevents, is what becomes impossible when grammar enforces honesty, when structure mandates correspondence between inner and outer, and the correspondence is total, is complete, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the gap between public and private, between performed and felt, between what is shown and what is hidden. And the hidden is what personality depends on, is what social existence requires, is the capacity to present one face while feeling another, to say one thing while thinking another, to perform emotions that are not felt, sincerity that is not sincere, interest that is not interest, and the performance is what social interaction is what politeness requires, is what allows people to coexist without constant conflict, without brutal honesty, without the expression of every negative thought, every hostile feeling, every moment of contempt or boredom or disgust, and the disgust is felt but is not expressed, is hidden behind polite formulas, behind social conventions, behind the lies that are not considered lies because they are expected, are required, are the price of social harmony. And harmony is what would be lost, is what would become impossible in a language that prevents lying, that forces honesty, that makes every utterance correspond to internal state. Because internal states are not harmonious, are not polite, are not socially appropriate, are often hostile, often judgmental, often incompatible with the smooth functioning of social interaction, and the interaction would become impossible, or would become very different, would require the development of new norms, new expectations, new ways of managing honesty that is mandatory, that cannot be avoided, that must be expressed whenever speech is used. And the using would become dangerous, would become revealing, would become the exposure of the self that is normally protected, normally hidden, normally kept private through the mechanism of deception, through the capacity to say what is not thought, to perform what is not felt, to present a self that is not the self, and the not the self is what social existence allows, is what makes personality possible, is what creates the gap between inner and outer that is identity. That is the performance of being someone, of presenting a self to others, and the presenting would be impossible in the language that prevents lying, that forces correspondence, that makes inner states visible through the act of speaking, and speaking would become rare, would become dangerous, would become something to be avoided because it reveals, because it exposes, because it makes public what is usually private, and the private is what humans need, is what allows them to have thoughts that are not shared, feelings that are not expressed, judgments that are not voiced, and the voicing would be automatic, would be forced by grammar, would make silence the only protection, the only privacy, the only way to hide what is usually hidden through lying, through deception, through the performance of false statements. And the false would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be something that cannot be said. And the cannot is structural, is built into the language, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the layers that are usually present, the masks that are usually worn, the performances that are usually given. And what remains is not authenticity, but is exposure, is not honesty, but is compulsion, is not truth, but is the forced revelation of internal states. And the states are complex, are contradictory, are not fitting the narratives that people tell about themselves, are not matching the identities that are performed, are revealing the gap between who people claim to be and who they are. And the are is not simple, is not singular, is not the unified self that is presented, but is the multiplicity, the contradiction, the incoherence that is usually hidden, that is usually managed through selective expression, through lying, through the performance of consistency that does not exist, and the existence is what the language would reveal, is what mandatory honesty would expose, is the inconsistency, the multiplicity, the contradictions that are the self, and the self would be different, would be unable to maintain the fiction of unity, would be forced to express the contradictions, to acknowledge the multiplicity, to reveal the incoherence, and the revealing would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of speaking at all, and speaking would become rare, would become something that happens only when necessary, only when the exposure is worth the information conveyed, only when the revelation is. acceptable, and the acceptable would be rare, would be limited to contexts where honesty is safe, where exposure does not create danger, does not produce conflict, does not destroy relationships. And relationships would be different, would be based on actual knowledge rather than on performance, on actual states rather than on presentations, on honesty that is forced rather than on lies that are chosen. And the chosen is what current relationships allow, is what makes them possible, is the capacity to select what is revealed, to manage what is expressed, to perform the self that is needed in each context, and the context would determine what is said, what is shown, what is hidden. But in the language that prevents lying, the hiding would be impossible, the selection would be impossible. The only choice would be silence or exposure, and the exposure would be total, would be revealing not just the thought that is being expressed, but the state that underlies it, the feeling that accompanies it, the judgment that is being made, and the judgment would be visible, would be expressed, would be unavoidable, and the avoiding is what social interaction depends on, is what allows people to coexist despite judgments, despite hostilities, despite the negative feelings that are normal, that are universal, that are kept private through the mechanism of deception, and the deception would be impossible, would be eliminated by grammar, would be structurally prevented, and what would remain is silence, is the choice to not speak, is the only privacy available, the only protection against exposure, against revelation, against the forcing of honesty that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve through structure, through grammar, through the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually corresponds to internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become dangerous, would become rare, would become something to be avoided, and the avoiding would be the new form of privacy, the new way of hiding, the new mechanism for protecting the self. And the self would be different, would be unable to perform, unable to lie, unable to maintain the fictions that are identity, that are personality, that are the social self that is presented to others. And the others would know, would see, would be unable to be deceived. And the deception is what social interaction depends on, is what allows harmony, is what prevents constant conflict. And the conflict would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of mandatory honesty, of forced expression, of the elimination of the capacity to lie. And lying is what humans do, is how they interact, is how they maintain relationships, is how they navigate social worlds. And the worlds would be different, would be impossible, would be unrecognizable in a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty through grammar, that eliminates deception through structure. And the structure is what would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make everything different, because lying is fundamental, is pervasive, is constant, is the way that humans communicate, is the mechanism through which they manage others, through which they protect themselves, through which they maintain the fictions that are necessary for functioning. And the functioning would be impossible, would be eliminated, would be replaced by something else, something that is not yet imaginable, something that would emerge from the constraint, from the mandatory honesty, from the impossibility of lying. And the impossibility is what the language would create, is what grammar would enforce, is what would make deception structurally prevented, grammatically impossible, utterly unavailable. And the unavailable is lying, is deception, is the gap between inner and outer. And the gap would close, would be eliminated, would be structurally prevented by a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty, that reveals internal states, that exposes the self, that eliminates privacy, that makes personality different, that makes identity different, that makes social existence different, that makes everything different. And the different is what would emerge, is what would result, is what a language that makes lying impossible would create. And the creating would be radical, would be transformative, would be making human existence unrecognizable, would be eliminating the deception. That is fundamental, that is pervasive, that is constant, that is the way humans communicate, and the communication would be different, would be based on honesty that is forced, on expression that is mandatory, on revelation that is unavoidable, and the unavoidable is what makes lying impossible, is what grammar enforces, is what structure mandates, is what a language could do, could create, could impose. If the language were designed to prevent deception, to force honesty, to make lying grammatically impossible, syntactically unavailable, structurally prevented, and the prevention is what would make everything different, would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make communication different, would make humanity different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and the imposing would be total, would be complete, would be unavoidable, would be the structure that makes deception impossible, that makes lying ungrammatical, that makes honesty mandatory, that makes expression revealing, that makes personality different, that makes the self exposed, that makes privacy impossible, that makes silence the only hiding, that makes speaking dangerous, that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve, is what grammar would enforce, is what structure would mandate, is what would make everything different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would produce, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and lying would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be structurally prevented, would be utterly unavailable, would be eliminated by grammar, by structure, by the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only truth, only honesty, only correspondence, only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually matches internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made visible, would be exposed through speaking, and speaking would be dangerous, would be rare, would be avoided, and the avoiding would be the only privacy, the only protection, the only way to hide in a language that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying is what deception is what the language creates, is what grammar enforces, is what makes honesty mandatory, what makes expression revealing, what makes personality different, what makes the self exposed, what makes lying impossible. And impossible is the grammar, is the structure, is the language that makes lying impossible. Some ideas are not just dangerous to power, but are dangerous to existence, are not just threatening social order, but are threatening ontological stability, are not just challenging beliefs, but are challenging the structure of being itself, are ideas that when fully grasped, when completely understood, when thoroughly integrated into consciousness, produce not conversion or enlightenment, but erasure, produce the literal disappearance of those who think them, who follow them to their conclusion, who allow the ideas to transform consciousness in ways that eliminate the thinker, that dissolve the boundary between thought and reality in ways that make continued existence impossible. And the impossible is what happened, is what the records show before they were destroyed, before the archives were sealed, before the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened the continued presence of those who understood it, who saw what it revealed, who followed the logic to its endpoint and found that the endpoint was absence, was vanishing, was the ceasing to be that is not death but is something else, is something that leaves no body, no trace, no evidence except the gap where the person was, the empty space where consciousness used to organize reality. And the reality is what these ideas touch, is what they undermine, is what they show to be contingent on consciousness in ways that, when understood completely, cause consciousness to withdraw its support, to stop maintaining the structure, to allow the collapse that is not into death but into non-being, into the state that is not a state, that is not anything, because it is the absence of the conditions that make anything possible. And the possible is what these ideas eliminate, is what they show to be dependent on not thinking them, on not understanding them, on maintaining the illusion that being is independent of belief, that existence is objective, that reality persists regardless of consciousness. And the regardless is what the dangerous philosophy denies, is what it shows to be false, is what it demonstrates through argument so compelling, through reasoning so rigorous, through insight so penetrating that those who follow it fully cease to provide the support that their own existence requires, cease to maintain the belief that sustains them, cease to participate in the collective agreement that makes reality real. And the real is what they stop being, is what they withdraw from, is what they are erased from, not by dying but by understanding, not by external force but by internal recognition, not by anything happening to them, but by their ceasing to happen, by their withdrawing the participation that made them exist. And the existing is what stops, is what ends, is what results in disappearance. That is literal, that is complete, that is leaving no body. Because there was never a body in the sense that is usually meant. There was only consciousness organizing sensations into the pattern called body, organizing perceptions into the pattern called world. And when that organizing stops, when that consciousness withdraws, when that participation ends, there is no body to leave behind, no corpse to bury, no physical trace, only the gap, the absence, the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the evidence shows, is what the witnesses describe before they too understand, before they too follow the reasoning, before they too are erased by the philosophy that is too dangerous to think, too powerful to contain, too true to refute. And the refutation is what is needed, is what authorities attempted, is what scholars tried to provide. But the refutation requires understanding the argument, requires following the reasoning, requires thinking the thoughts, and the thinking is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous, not to society, but to being. And being is what is at stake, is what the philosophy threatens, is what those who understand it cease to maintain. And the cessation is immediate, is total, is leaving no trace except the memory in others who did not fully understand, who stopped short of complete comprehension, who pulled back from the final step. And the step is what the censored chapter describes, is what was removed from every ethics textbook, is what was found to produce not moral transformation, but ontological dissolution, not changed behaviour, but disappeared persons. And the persons who disappeared were not killed, were not removed by force, were not eliminated by authorities, but simply ceased to be there, ceased to occupy space, ceased to organise reality, ceased to participate in existence. And the existence is. What requires participation is what depends on consciousness, maintaining belief, maintaining engagement, maintaining the structures that make being possible. And when those structures are withdrawn, when that maintenance stops, when that participation ends, there is no being, there is no presence, there is only absence. And the absence is what remains when someone thinks the dangerous thought, understands the forbidden idea, follows the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not death but is erasure, is not ending but is never having been, is the withdrawal from existence that leaves no evidence except the gap, the space, the absence where someone was, and the was becomes uncertain, becomes questionable. Because if someone ceases to exist completely, ceases to have existed at all, then the memories of them become suspect, become unreliable, become the only trace of something that might not have happened. And the happening is what becomes uncertain, is what the philosophy undermines, is what it shows to depend on belief, on agreement, on the collective maintenance of narrative. And when one consciousness withdraws, when one participant stops maintaining, the others feel the gap. Notice the absence. Remember something that is no longer supported by reality. And the reality is what adjusts, is what fills in the gap, is what eliminates the traces, is what makes it as if the person never was. And the never was is the final stage. Is what happens after the initial disappearance, is the completion of the erasure, is the adjustment of reality to the absence, is the closing of the gap, is the collective forgetting that is not intentional but is structural, is the result of reality being maintained by agreement, by consensus, by the collective participation of consciousness. And when one consciousness withdraws, the structure adjusts, the pattern reforms, the absence is absorbed, and what remains is less than memory, is less than trace, is the vague sense that something is missing, something is wrong, something has changed, but the what is inaccessible is already fading, is already being absorbed into the adjustment, and the adjustment is complete, is total, is making it as if the disappeared never existed, never participated, never contributed to the maintenance of reality. And the reality is what continues, is what persists, is what remains. After the erasure, but the remains is less, is diminished, is showing the gap to those who know to look, who understand what has been lost, who remember what the adjustment is erasing, and the erasure is ongoing, is continuous, is the fate of those who think the dangerous thought, who understand the forbidden philosophy, who follow the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is the ceasing to be that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the stopping of participation, is the ending of the maintenance that made existence possible. And the possible is what these people are no longer, is what they cease to be, is what they withdraw from by understanding too much, by seeing too clearly, by recognizing the contingency that makes being dependent on not seeing, on not understanding, on maintaining the illusion that existence is objective, that reality is independent, that being is not requiring constant support. And the support is what consciousness provides, is what participation maintains, is what the collective agreement enforces. And when one withdraws, when one sees through, when one understands the philosophy that makes people disappear, the withdrawal is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of understanding, and the understanding cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten, cannot be suppressed once achieved. And the achieving is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous. And the dangerous is why it was banned, why it was censored, why the chapter was removed, why the philosophers vanished, why the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being. Not because it challenged authority, but because it challenged existence. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. Was revealing what must remain hidden, was exposing the dependence that must be denied, was showing the contingency that must be suppressed. And the suppression is what authorities attempted, is what the banning achieved, is what the censorship maintained. But the knowledge persists, is waiting, is available to those who seek it, who find the fragments, who reconstruct the argument, who follow the reasoning, and the following is what produces the disappearance, is what causes the erasure, is what makes those who understand vanish, not into death but into absence, not into somewhere else but into nowhere, not into another state but into the cessation of states, into the withdrawal from being that is not non-being but is the ending of the distinction, is the collapse of the boundary, is the recognition that being requires participation and that participation can be withdrawn. And the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy produces, is what those who understand fully cannot avoid, because the understanding is transformation, is alteration of consciousness in ways that make continued participation impossible, that make maintenance of existence unavoidable, that make the withdrawal automatic. And the automatic is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it spread, is what makes it necessary to suppress, because those who partially understand become dangerous to others, become carriers of fragments that, if combined, could produce the full understanding, could cause more disappearances, could threaten the collective maintenance that makes reality real. And the real is what depends on not understanding, on not thinking certain thoughts, on not following certain arguments, on stopping short of certain conclusions. And the conclusions are what the censored chapter reached, is what the disappeared philosophers understood, is what the dangerous philosophy contains, is what makes thinking it produce erasure, produce disappearance, produce the vanishing that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the ceasing to participate, is the ending of maintenance, is the stopping of the support that consciousness provides. To being, and being is what ends, is what those who think the dangerous thought cease to maintain, cease to be part of, cease to exist within. And the within is what they withdraw from, is what they cease to support, is what they allow to collapse for themselves. And the collapsing is their disappearance, is their erasure, is their vanishing. And the vanishing is complete, is total, is leaving no trace, no body, no evidence, only the gap, only the absence, only the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the dangerous philosophy produces, is what thinking it creates, is what understanding it causes. And the causing is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of comprehension, and comprehension is what produces disappearance, produces erasure, produces the vanishing that is not death but is ontological suicide, is the withdrawal from existence through understanding, is the ceasing to be through recognition, is the disappearance that happens when consciousness understands that being depends on not understanding, that existence requires ignorance, that reality is maintained through participation that can be withdrawn, and the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it banned, is what makes people disappear, and disappearing is what those who think it do, is what those who understand it become, is what those who follow it to its conclusion achieve, which is not enlightenment but is erasure, is not transcendence but is vanishing, is not liberation but is disappearance, is the ceasing to be, that is literal, that is complete, that is the result of understanding the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappearing is what it does, is what it causes, is what makes it the most dangerous idea, the most forbidden knowledge, the philosophy that breaks reality, that causes ontological suicide, that produces erasure through understanding. And understanding is what causes disappearance, is what makes people vanish, is what the banned philosophy does, and doing is what it continues to do, is what it will always do. To those who think it, who understand it, who follow it to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending of being through understanding, is ontological suicide through philosophy, is the dangerous thought that makes people disappear. And disappearing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappear they did, and disappear they will. Those who think it, those who understand it, those who follow the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is absence, is vanishing, is erasure, is disappearance. And disappearance is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is the philosophy that makes people disappear. And disappear is what they do, is what understanding causes, is what the dangerous thought produces, is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending through. Understanding is the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear.